Washington State trucker William Talbott convicted in the 1987 cold case slayings of 18-year-old Tanya Van Cuylenborg and her boyfriend, 20-year-old Jay Cook.
What if you one day find out someone in your ancestry or family was actually a sex offender or heinous killer? Maybe you don't know him, never met him, or maybe you know him as an uncle who's always smiling. Would you feel bad, thrilled, or something else? This is not a hypothetical scenario. This really happened to CeCe Moore from Tumwater, Washington. But that's not all. It also solved a gruesome rape and murder mystery that's been unsolved for 3 decades. I know what you are thinking. Who, what, when, and how? Yes, questions are many. But answers, let's find out. It was 2013 when CeCe Moore, a genealogy enthusiast, suddenly decided to dig into her family history. It was just out of curiosity in genealogy. But little did she know that this curiosity would lead her on a journey she never expected. Just 2 years later, she got lucky and won an ancestry DNA kit through a Facebook contest. Excited, she sent in her DNA sample, thinking it would just confirm her ethnic background and maybe connect her with a few distant relatives who she didn't know about. And around the same time, CeCe Moore, a genetic genealogist who uses DNA to help solve violent crimes, was making a name for herself. She had gained attention after helping crack the Golden State Killer case using genetic genealogy. This method proved it could be a powerful tool for law enforcement as well, often uncovering family secrets people never knew existed. Coincidentally, one of her biggest breakthroughs came with the case of Tanya Van Cuylenborg and Jay Cook, a young Canadian couple who mysteriously vanished in 1987 while on a road trip from Vancouver Island to Seattle. For years, no one knew what happened to them until their bodies were found, Tanya near Mount Vernon and Jay near Monroe. Both had been brutally murdered, with Jay strangled. Then, fast forward to 2018, CeCe received a call that would change everything. Investigators showed up at her relative's door, saying they were looking into some family members for a certain person for the murders. But the name they were looking for had never popped up on any suspect list and was unknown to CeCe as having anything to do with the case. Naturally, genetic genealogy became the solution to the mystery. DNA enabled investigators to link CeCe's relative to the crime, something that would have been nearly impossible without this technique. Thanks to CeCe's hard work and sharp skills in analyzing DNA matches, she helped law enforcement crack the case and identify the killer. Detective Jim Scharf of Snohomish County Cold Case was all in on the investigation into the 1987 murders of Tanya Van Cuylenborg and Jay Cook. Tanya, fresh out of high school at just 18, was in a relationship with 20-year-old Jay. On November 18, 1987, they drove from British Columbia to Seattle in Jay's van for a pit stop, intending to return to Canada the next day. But the next day, they didn't show up. Their family started getting worried. Tanya's brother John even got a call from their dad asking if Tanya would have just up and left without telling anyone, something she would never do. So the police jumped into action. By November 24th, they found Tanya's body in Skagit County, about 80 miles north of Seattle. She had been shot in the head and left in a ditch, and to worsen the matter, it was clear she'd been sexually assaulted. The next day, Tanya's things, like her wallet and keys, were found dumped near a tavern in Bellingham. They also found the van, but Jay was still nowhere to be found. Then, just a day later, Jay's body turned up 70 miles south under Highbridge. He had been strangled, and strangely, a pack of cigarettes had been shoveled down his throat. It was looking more and more like the work of either a serial killer or perhaps an ex-con, but there weren't so many leads to go on at this point. The crime scenes covered 4 areas in 3 counties, and evidence at this point was not enough. A bullet casing was found near Tanya's body, the same as ones found around the tavern, but they did not find the gun. They also found a surgical glove under the tavern porch, like the killer did not want to leave fingerprints. But still, who knows? That could have been a slip on his part, and so there was this palm print found on the back of a van, and at first, it seemed like the big break in the case. Maybe it would link the suspect directly to the crime. But then things took a turn. Inside the van, investigators found something that seemed more significant: black pants, which turned out to belong to Tanya. And they even found semen on the pants. DNA tests revealed it was not a match to Jay, but instead belonged to someone completely unknown. They gave this person a name, Individual A. And that sample became the key piece of evidence. Now, when they began looking at the crime scenes, the connections between them were pretty limited. The one thing that kept popping up was plastic zip ties, and they were discovered close to the bodies of Tanya and Jay, under a porch, and even inside the van. Detective Scharf thought those zip ties could be part of the killer's rape-murder kit, so this was likely an orchestrated attack. He concluded that the killer was after rape victims and perhaps murder. Tanya and Jay were described as quiet, mild-tempered people, making it unlikely they provoked any killer. It only seemed to get worse for Tanya. Her family posted a $50,000 reward for tips that could lead to someone's arrest. But in the end, all that came in was nothing. They looked into more than 200 names over time, including some felons and even a serial killer named Charles Sinclair, suspected of committing crimes across the western United States. But that's when things got creepy. They received anonymous, threatening letters sent to both families claiming it was the killer, taunting them. Yet DNA testing on all the suspects did not match the profile of Individual A. For years, investigators were stuck on the murders of Tanya Van Cuylenborg and Jay Cook. They had DNA evidence, but it wasn't enough to figure out who did it. Lisa Collins, a forensic scientist, did what she could and uploaded the DNA to CODIS, the FBI's National Offender Database, hoping for a match. But even after that, nothing happened. Time passed by, and the case remained unsolved and cold for over 30 years. It seemed like this will also be another unsolved mystery like Jack the Ripper. But then, out of nowhere, things started to change. More than 3 decades after the murders, a new lead came in. In 2017, Detective Jim Scharf is told about this new, next-generation tool called snapshot phenotyping, created by Parabon Nanolabs. This technology uses DNA to predict what the suspect might look like, based on their genetic traits, and it even makes composite sketches of what they could look like at different ages. So with DNA from a male sample, who they called Individual A, Parabon generated composite images of the suspect at ages 25, 45, and 65. But the mystery wasn't over yet. They still didn't know who this person was. Then, in 2018, something huge happened. The Golden State Killer who terrorized California for decades was finally caught. The breakthrough came because of genetic genealogy, a method that connects DNA to distant relatives using public genetic databases. They uploaded the killer's DNA to GEDmatch, a website where people share their DNA info, and suddenly, this led to his arrest after 43 years of avoiding the law. And this same method of genetic genealogy would end up being the key to solving the cold case of Tanya and Jay's murders. So after the big win of Parabon, they had it uploaded Individual A's DNA into GEDmatch. Hopefully this would reveal family connections. They brought CeCe Moore for this. For her, it really had a lot of emotional punch because she was the same age as Tanya Van Cuylenborg when the murder took place. CeCe was deeply and personally moved by the tragedy and had a deep personal relationship with the victims. For that reason, she wanted badly to crack the case. Fast forward to Friday, April 27, 2018. Parabon uploaded Individual A's DNA file to GEDmatch and started comparing it to the database. And the next morning, the list of possible matches came in. Turns out 2 people were second cousins to Individual A. But here's the twist. They were from totally different branches of his family tree, and they didn't even share DNA with each other. One of these second cousins was Chelsea Rustad, who had put her DNA up after she did an ancestry test. From there, CeCe Moore got to work. She was able to trace the family connections back in just 2 hours and figure out who most likely committed the cold case murder of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg 31 years ago. Moore had figured out who the guy was: William Earl Talbott II. Monday, April 30th, 2018. Detective Jim Scharf got the call. Over 30 years of dead ends and chases on false leads would finally be coming down to just one suspect. Scharf searched through the system for William Talbott's name. It brought no familiar faces, no criminal record. But what caught Scharf's attention was the fact that Talbott lived merely 7 miles from the spot where Jay's body had been found. That was odd. Even more bizarre, Scharf discovered that in 1987, when Talbott was 24, he served as a delivery driver. His path happened to go close to the same place where Jay and Tanya had been to collect that part of the furnace. Months before that, Talbott was fired but had been within the proximity of the scene of murders. Scharf asked himself whether Talbott may have come across Jay and Tanya in the process. Anyway, the case could not be carried forward without concrete evidence. Scharf had to ensure that the DNA left behind by the unknown individual A matched Talbott's. The way to do this was to obtain a new DNA sample from him. The team devised a plan to obtain saliva from Talbott, probably the easiest and most reliable way to obtain his DNA. They would follow him around and collect any items he might dispose of, especially anything that could have come into contact with his mouth. It turned out Talbott was now driving a semi-truck, so they began to follow him. A week later, while tailing him at a red light, they saw him open his truck door. When the light turned green, he slammed the door shut and drove off. As he moved down the road, a white paper cup blew across the street and landed behind. The investigators rushed to grab the cup and immediately contacted Scharf. Scharf did not waste any time and forwarded the cup to forensic scientist Lisa Collins with the Washington State Patrol, asking her to run a DNA test. He was on edge, hoping this would be the break he needed to tie Talbott to the case. Meanwhile, back at HQ, CeCe Moore decided to dig a little deeper about Talbott online. The result was weird, basically no record of his existence as such. No marriage record, no social media sites. Nothing of this sort existed about him for someone so aged. It was really out of the ordinary because most have at least a digital trail. In reality, it almost reminded her of a search that Chelsea Rustad had conducted years ago in 2013. Chelsea had simply Googled her grand-aunt Blanche and found a pretty surprising thing. She discovered that the daughter of Blanche was called Patty Talbott, who herself had 3 daughters and 1 son, named William Earl Talbott II. This brought the second cousin to Chelsea, which was a pretty big lead to the case. Fast forward to 2018, and Chelsea, who had reached out to 2 of her cousins on Facebook, finally discovered that their brother, William Earl Talbott, was linked to a cold case from 1987. Chelsea had uploaded her DNA to ancestry.com and GEDmatch, and it wasn't long before investigators reached out to her. They told her that William was now a person of interest in a murder case. At first, Chelsea was very shocked. She wondered if William had become estranged from his family over the years. As investigators dug deeper into William's past, they discovered a disturbing history. He had been having anger and violence issues since age 11 after a traumatic event surrounding his father's motorcycle accident. His sisters also spoke about abuse incidents involving physical violence, but one of the sisters did not believe that he could be a murderer. Detective Scharf had indeed been digging into Talbott's behaviors for a while. Finally, on May 17, 2018, nearly 31 years after the crime, Detective Scharf finally arrested Talbott for the 1987 murders of Jay and Tanya. The next day, Talbott was charged with Tanya's murder, and Jay's charges came not long after. Detective Scharf credited improvements in DNA technology, specifically genetic genealogy, with the arrest. But naturally, people began asking if such a new kind of evidence could be used in court. He was facing 2 counts of aggravated murder, and in June 2019, his trial began. This was the first case of its kind as a suspect was brought to light through genetic genealogy, although the Golden State Killer case had already put that method in the spotlight. The prosecution, led by Chief Criminal Deputy Matthew Baldock, was unsure how the court would handle this new kind of evidence since there were no legal guidelines to follow. The prosecution figured it might be a smart move to bypass any potential sparring and just get the defense to concede that the DNA found at the crime scene belonged to Talbott. The defense agreed, so the DNA evidence was pretty much done and dusted. But then Talbott's lawyers, John Scott and Rachel Ford, came up with an argument. Maybe there was an innocent reason for the DNA, like maybe it came from some consensual sex. It was a pretty big moment for the use of genetic genealogy in criminal cases. Talbott's defense team didn't deny he'd had sexual contact with Tanya, but they made it clear he wasn't involved in either her or Jay's deaths. They threw out the idea that the couple must have run into their killer after disappearing for a few days. When they were asked what they thought happened to Tanya and Jay, they didn't seem sure, suggesting the two could have been off on some wild adventure, maybe hitting up bars or clubs. They also argued that it wasn't strange for Talbott to forget meeting Tanya or where he had been 30 years ago. They pointed out there was no direct evidence connecting him to the murders, like the gun, cigarettes, or the stuff used to strangle Jay. The prosecutors, however, had their own pile of evidence. They had Tanya's DNA on Talbott's body, plus he was really close to where Jay's body was found. They also found a palm print on a van that matched Talbott's, and zip ties at all the crime scenes, which they said linked Jay's murder to Tanya's. Baldock thought Talbott might have used those zip ties to tie up both victims after he kidnapped them. Then there was a little twist. Forensic scientist Lisa Collins was able to use some new fancy software to connect Talbott's DNA to a zip tie found in Jay's van. However, this discovery came too late to be brought up during the trial, and the prosecutors did not want to mess up the timing. Talbott did not testify, hoping the jury would find that there was not enough solid evidence to convict him. They attempted to convey the message that just because the DNA of William Talbott was present at the scene, he wasn't the killer by all means. But Baldock argued that the only believable story for the case was that Talbott had planned to rape Tanya, then killed both Tanya and Jay Cook. After 2 weeks of battling in the courtroom, the jury took 3 days to deliberate before finally returning a verdict. And on the third day, they found Talbott guilty of the first-degree murders of Tanya and Jay. Then at Talbott's sentencing, Chelsea Rustad, who hadn't spoken to either of the victims' families, showed up with their blessing. It was a little awkward for her. She was basically a family member of the convicted killer, but she still had to give credit to John for his courage in letting her be there. At the sentencing, Jay's mom gave this heartbreaking speech about how she still held on to her son's old sweater and would smell it when she missed him. It was gut-wrenching. The judge handed down the mandatory sentence, life without parole, meaning Talbott would be locked up for 2 consecutive life terms. And that was that, justice finally. And Chelsea? Even with that connection, she made it clear where she stood, fully behind the victims. She felt proud that her DNA became part of catching a killer. So what do you think about this bizarre case? How would you feel if you were Chelsea Rustad? Share your thoughts in the comments. And now if you want to see an even more bizarre case that almost became a cold case until a tree helped the detectives to solve the crime, click on this video. Subscribe for more true crime stories. See you soon.